If your app uses background threads for loading or processing data, and pretty much every app will need those at some point, you might have to take special precautions to make your UI tests run reliably. Espresso does most of the heavy lifting for you, waiting for lifecycle events to finish and checking if the UI is idle. But it can't always know what the other parts of your app are doing, and you might need to write some additional code to make synchronization possible. Let me show you on an example. I'll create a new project in Android Studio with the empty activity template. Let's do some initial setup for testing. I'll add the Android runner, rules, and Espresso dependencies in my Android test scope. If you're ever unsure what the newest versions for Espresso packages are, consult the documentation or our testing samples on GitHub, which we always keep up to date. I then set up the test instrumentation runner, and we're done here. On to the main activity class. The only thing it does right now is set a layout with a text view. Let me open the layout and change that text and give the text view an ID. In onResume, I'm going to change the text, and I'll just quickly extract the string into a resource for later reuse. Let's create a UI test for the activity using an Android Studio shortcut. Add the annotation to use the Android test runner first. Then I need to set up the activity test rule that will start my activity and check if the correct text is displayed. I run the test and it passes. That's because Espresso waits until the app processes all lifecycle events, and I'm setting the text string in onResume, remember? Let's simulate a more realistic scenario where the data takes some time to load. Async task is one of the simplest ways to do background work and then pass a result back to the main thread. So what happens when I run the test now? Surprisingly, it passes. That's because Espresso also knows how to synchronize on the async task thread pool out of the box. And because async tasks are also at the heart of any async task loader, including cursor loaders, they just work. Of course, there's lots of other ways you can schedule background work. It can be connecting to a remote API using a custom thread pool or through handler messaging. You can see I'm changing the code to use a separate thread, which sleeps for 5 seconds to simulate background work, then posts the change back to the main thread. When I run the test, it fails immediately. As soon as onResume returns and the activity is idle, Espresso is trying to validate the message on the text view and it fails, because the runnable hasn't had a chance to run yet. That's when you have to use idling resource to tell Espresso when your app is busy processing. I'll use an implementation of an idling resource that we provide with Espresso called counting idling resource. It's very simple to use, and it basically lets you increment a counter for every resource that is busy when you're waiting for something to finish loading, and decrement it when it's done. Espresso will automatically run whenever the counter is at 0. I'll give it a name, data loader, used mostly for logging, but it has to be unique among registered idling resources. Now, increment before scheduling my runnable and decrement when it's done. The only thing left is to register the resource with Espresso. In the test class, I'll add a setup method to grab the idling resource instance from the activity. And it's done. Run test. After 5 seconds, the counter gets decremented and the test passes. To sum up, if your tests are flaky or outright failing because of background threads and asynchronous events, use idling resource to tell Espresso when to pause and resume its work. That's all for this episode. Happy testing.